What's up, Preacher Creatures, and welcome back to the Preacher Creature podcast. I'm so excited that you're here to join us today. My name is Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary.
And I'm Ashley Lewis. I'm a ministry professional in Durham, North Carolina.
So we have a very amazing book to share with you today. I
Yes.
am really impressed with the quality of this book and all that I know that it's going to do for the church. And it's written by my friend, Dr. Karyn Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman is an ordained pastor in the United Church of Christ denomination, and she grew up in the United Methodist Church, and she has 21 years of experience pastoring churches in Kansas, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And currently she serves as the Herman G. Strumpfel Associate Professor of Homiletics at United Lutheran Seminary in Pennsylvania.
So, Dr. Wiseman has written this bold and beautiful book that we are highly recommending for any preacher that's hoping to take their preaching to the next level. It's titled Queering the Pulpit, a Sexegetical Approach to Preaching an Inclusive Word. Her thesis is that a significant part of the pain inflicted by preachers comes in this bashing that's felt not only in the language of the church, but in the core values that are far too often not inclusive of queer folks. And it comes in the continued use of scriptures that we know of as clobber passages, the parts of the church that where these are used as a tool for condemnation and to justify this unwillingness to speak to the queer community that uses language that's positive and affirming. So in this book, we are being introduced to a radically inclusive homiletic. It includes tools that you can actually apply in your preaching and in the community life of the church. We owe a great debt to Dr. Wiseman for not only the homiletical work that she's doing in this book, but also the way that she shares her experiences so beautifully, so bravely and courageously. She's experienced a lot that has prevented her in ministry from being her full self. And now she's in a position where I think she would say that she's really brought something forth that has been in the making for her whole life. So we have such gratitude for her for this book and can't wait for others to read it.
Yeah, Dr. Wiseman and I have been friends since I first entered the Guild of Homiletics, and she's been encouraging and supportive, and she's always been there with like a humorous anecdote or an encouraging word, and all of her personality just shines through this amazing book. So I
It really
know that
does.
you're going to be pumped to get access to it. I'm glad that it's out in print. And without further ado, Ashley, let's bring Dr. Wiseman in and chat with her a little bit about this book.
Let's do it.
Dr. Wiseman, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an honor to have you on the Preacher Creature
I
podcast.
am so honored just to be asked to, but particularly to talk about this book and to visit with you too about it and how preachers might learn and grow from it and do some different things that maybe are a little braver.
Yeah, well, this is a fantastic book. You know that I've been a big fan of it. I've been kind of asking you about it for years. I'm so excited that it's out
Me
in
too.
print. And we'd like to get started with a question we ask all of our authors, and just to get you to tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book and what you hope that it will do for preachers in their preaching ministry.
Yeah, it's hard to explain this in a short sentence, but let me say just a couple of things. One, I grew up in the United Methodist Church. My dad was a United Methodist pastor. I became a United Methodist pastor knowing that I was queer, but not knowing what to do with these conflicting situations that were going on in my life. And I was in the United Methodist Church, and our conference Board of Ordained Ministry, which sort of vets people to come in to ministry, had been challenged by the bishop at the time that if they asked the question, it was sort of a don't ask, don't tell. If they asked the question, then they were going to have to answer questions about their own bedroom behavior. And it was one of those things where nobody asked, and I just went into the ministry and thought, I'll just hide and no one will know, and I won't ever be, I won't be in a relationship. And that's not how the world works out often. But I did. Cindy and I met in seminary. We've been together for 31 years. It was 22 years before
Wow.
we could get married. And in that 22 years, I served a number of different churches. I was a campus pastor. I solo pastored. I was an associate pastor. Felt called to come to go to graduate school and get my PhD. And as a part of that was our son was at the age we had adopted him. He was at the age where I didn't want to teach him to lie. I didn't want someone to say, "Hey, why isn't Indy, Cindy live with Karyn? What's the deal?" Or, "Why do you call Cindy mom too?" And it just became, I got to get out of the ministry, but I've been feeling for a long time that I'm called to teach preaching. So did that. Shelby flourished. We've never taught him to lie. He is known from day one that he was a child of two queer parents, and that he was an adopted child. And, he just grew up with all kinds of reality in his face. And so I had thought about this book probably for, I don't know, I started thinking about it in grad school. I started grad school in 2001. And I kept thinking, I'd love to do something about being gay, but I can't do something about being gay. And so I thought, I'll just, I'll forget it. There's no book there. And then when marriage equality happened, I just felt very convicted that that was an opportunity for us to solidify a relationship that had never been solidified legally or religiously or in any kind of ceremony. And I asked her to marry me in December, I guess. We were in, we're at the Coronado Hotel out in San Diego for the Academy of Homiletics. She came with me and I invited her to marry me out on the beach. That was in November or December, and we didn't announce it until August. We had given save the dates and talked to our families. Everybody knew it was happening, but we didn't publicly announce it until August. And I put it up. I copied it and made a statement. She proved it. We copied it and we posted it at the same time on our Facebook feeds. And it said, after 22 long years, we are finally getting to do what so many of you have already done. And we're excited about this. We know it's a new adventure. We know that that this is going to be an amazing opportunity, but it starts a new chapter in our life. And so we put that on Facebook. And I kid you not, an hour and a half went by. And I got a message in my Facebook from my district superintendent out in Kansas. And he said, "You have just self-avowed that you are a practicing homosexual. Resign, or we will put you on church trial." Now, I knew that possibility was there. I knew when we posted it that that possibility was there. Was I ticked off that we only got an hour and a half before we got called on it? Yes. But I had started my transition to UCC in February, knowing that when it happened, I wasn't going to be able to stay. And so what was amazing was everything changed when we got married and nothing changed when we got married. Do you know what I mean? It's like everything had already been there, but there was there was this big new thing that was amazing. And I did a paper, 12, 14 years ago at the Academy of Homiletics, where I was just introducing this little nugget about sexegetical preaching. And I had forgotten about that. I'm writing this book. I'm feeling free. I'm like, book has been clouding my head forever, and I am going to do it. So I got a sabbatical. I started working on it, and I got halfway through, and I was like, "Cindy, I just don't know how to finish this book. I don't know. I've got to have a framework." And she said, "Well, think about it." 3 days later, memory popped up in Facebook that Karyn was at the Academy of Homiletics. She was doing a paper on sexegetical preaching. She sent me a copy of that and said, "You already wrote it." I'm like, crap, I wonder where that paper is. And so
Yeah, that's
it
awesome.
just, it really poured out of me. But in really amazing ways, it also was a struggle at times. It was an argument with myself at times. If you read this book, it is very personal. It is very much about my journey. And even that journey to use the word queer as a part of the title of this book was huge for me. And so there were times I was crying, real tears, and other times I felt like I was sweating blood, and felt at night that I was just totally exhausted after really struggling back and forth on something. And as I'm writing it, I keep thinking, this is happening in church pews all over the world, where someone is being told you're not okay, where someone is being denigrated, where somebody is being condemned, where some gay kid who wants to wear his hair long in a pink shirt and a bow tie is made fun of from the pulpit. Oh, it's kids' times. We know Jonah's going to come up in his little bow tie. And so I kept hearing these stories of people who were friends of mine, folks who were friends of mine telling other stories. And I was sort of trying to gather, what's happening out there. And it wasn't hard. I mean, I had youth come up to me in different church settings and say, I know you're safe, but I'm not safe at home. And I don't feel like I'm safe here. And so for me, I thought, if I pour this out of me and I show the struggle and I show the passion that I have for engaging preachers to preach a fully inclusive word, then this book could change lives. And if it only changes one life, it's worth it. Because there are a lot of preachers out there, they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to move past the traditional, typical writing of a sermon that has, an intro and a body and a conclusion, and we're doing all the exegetical stuff, and we may add application. And then it's like, wait a minute, who else is listening? Who do I need to craft this sermon for? And so part of this book is a challenge to rethink how we create sermons. And to use different lenses. And so for me, the greatest gift that I could give is for a preacher to say, I've done my exegetical stuff. I got to lay my sexegetical stuff right there beside it. Or I've figured out how to mesh the two. And then I feel like there's a chance that queer kid, is okay. And that mom whose husband just came out to her as trans. I mean, there's just so many things that I hope for. I'm not naive. I know that probably the group that I think most needs this book might not read this book. But I hope it's an invitation to at least challenge yourself to say, I wonder if there's anything that could help me really be a pastor to all the people in this book. And that's what I hope.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much. I love the way you put it in the book that really a queer affirming sermon needs to be wrapped in grace with a bow of acceptance on top, as that gift that you were just describing. And you challenge preachers to speak boldly and not just to the people who already know they are accepted. Yeah. So can you share a bit more with us and our listeners about how preaching can be a means of extending welcome to those who are pushed to the margins, as the way that the queer community is?
Yeah, I want to start with one observation that when you go to churches, any size, any denomination, probably anywhere in the world, and someone asks, are you welcoming? Are you a friendly church? 99.9% of them are going to go, of course we're a friendly church. But there's worship shoppers and mystery worshipers and all this kind of stuff out there, and people who experience that, who go to those churches and come back going, that was not a friendly place. That wasn't a safe place. And so part of it is to I think churches need to understand that just simply welcoming is a hard job. It is hard to give up your pew if a guest comes and sits in the pew that you've always sat in. It is hard to listen to a mom struggling with her toddler because there's no Sunday school or nursery for her child, but she wants to be in church. It is hard when a kid comes in and they have, tattoo sleeves and they come in with their crop top, and they come in and they're like, I want to go to church Christmas Eve, and everybody looks at them funny. So I think one of the things is to challenge that notion that churches are friendly, that they're welcoming. Once you do that, I think that it really has to be a learned behavior. And so part of it is saying to those who are sitting in the church, Christmas Eve is coming up. Here's what I hope you'll do when you see people. Say hello. Don't ask them their name. Just say, hey, my name is Sue. Are you new here? Or I haven't met you before. And so we literally practiced during the Sundays before Christmas Eve and before Easter to remind people what it meant to actually welcome folks into their community. But then that next step is to say, what if they don't look like us? What if they don't sound like us? What if they don't live like us? What if they vote differently than we do? I mean, there's all these layers that sort of have built up in our culture that separates and divides us. And so when we look at folks on the margins, one of the greatest examples of accepting people on the margins was Jesus, who said, there are not any margins. And he folds those corners into the middle, right? And so
I
there's
love
no
that.
margins. It keeps on rolling. It keeps on rolling. And it just makes this conglomeration that everyone is in the center. And that's really hard, because if everyone is accepted, who do we hate? You know,
Right.
who do we blame if things
Yeah.
go wrong? Who is our enemy, either manufactured or real? And I think that we have this natural tendency that we're suspicious of other people that we don't know. And to get past that, one thing that has to happen is that people need to understand the experience of queer folks. And so let's
Yeah.
take a motif that's very well known, and that is the Samaritan on the Good Samaritan story, right? And so there's a number of ways that this sermon gets preached. You've got the two religious leaders who pass by and don't even give any attention, and you have a sermon about the guilt that we should feel because we don't turn and look the other way or even help somebody. The other sermon often is that we're the Good Samaritan and look what great things we've been doing, and isn't it wonderful that we've got the extra resources that we can go pay for tonight and for the next 2 months while they recover. The third sermon rarely gets preached, and that's the sermon that gets preached from the viewpoint of the side of the road. What does it mean to be laying there and watching people walk by? What does it mean to lay there as a Black man in America, as a mom whose kids are trying to express themselves in new ways? What does it mean to a church that has bloodied a pastor? And I think part of it is we need to continue to reframe those stories. It's sort of a new hearing, sort of homiletical device that we take a text that's well known and we say, well, let's think about it from this perspective. So part of it is education. I mean, it's teaching people. What does it mean to have folks who are different? How do we welcome them? And the easiest thing is to welcome them just like you would welcome someone who sat in your pew, and you welcome them anyway. You welcome them just like the mom whose kid is noisy. And you just say, hey, how are you? I'm so glad to see you today. Are you new with us? To just begin to melt away the marginal language, but to mimic or to example ways that people can be really inclusive and welcoming. And I think that first means telling some stories about what's it like to be on the side of the road. And those are powerful stories, and sometimes they're not ours. Sometimes we borrow the story from someone else and we tell the story and say, you know what, that's my gay cousin. And there are different ways that we can sort of educate folks and invite them into a deeper sense of welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate so much how Jesus kind of becomes the homiletical exemplar that you kind of help us to see the ways in which he did fold those margins into the center. And I think we can miss that oftentimes in our preaching. And I love so much how you both celebrate the joy of preaching, but you remind us how hard it is to preach sermons that are radically open to people whose ways of being in the world are different from that of the dominant part of our churches. And so I love how you stress the political dynamics of preaching without forcing us into partisan politics. This can be really scary, especially in these divisive times that we're living in. I'd love to hear you kind of expound upon the need to preach politically in this political atmosphere that we're living in today.
Oh, yeah. I have a crocheted item in my office that says safe space. And every time I look at it, I'm like, I got to get rid of that. It just is stupid. It doesn't mean anything. What I want, I think my wife actually did that, so I should probably not talk about it too badly. But I want her to do me a new one that says brave space. because that's what I want us to do. I want us to create these opportunities for us to be brave. And in our political climate, it's very, very hard. Leah Shade, a friend of ours, wrote a book, Preaching from the Purple Zone. And it's a great book. If you haven't read it, you don't have it, get it. And it
Yeah,
talks about the
absolutely.
reality that we may have a hardened red Republican sitting on the same pew with a really diehard blue Democrat, and how do we find ways to talk to both of those people? And how do we figure out ways that we can preach and we're not trying to just play it so safe that we're like, I don't want to tick anybody off. And so if I just hold back and I don't say anything that's too controversial or that's too political or whatever, then people will like me and I won't be, the people won't be upset. And I remember the hardest sermon I've ever preached was the Sunday after Donald Trump was elected the first time. And I, like many people, was completely stunned, was just devastated to have an Act Two recently. And I stepped in that pulpit knowing that we had an immigrant family that was a part of our church that we were helping. And for them, the very election news was traumatic and frightening. We had people of color who were sitting there going, what is he going to do? How far is he going to push? How much lower is he going to allow the world to push us? And we had queer people. My son, the morning after the election, said, how long is your marriage going to be legal? And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that that's your feeling. And he said, no, it's reality. I think he'll do it. And so stepping up in that pulpit, I thought, I cannot say anyone who voted for Donald Trump is an idiot, is a a-hole, whatever. Anyone who voted for Trump voted against my interests and I can't stand you. What I could do was to stand up and say, you know what? Today is very scary for a lot of people sitting here. Today is a day when we don't celebrate. Today is a day when we don't denigrate. Today is a day when we sit in the fact that there are so many people in our country who are in deep mourning and grief right now. And I know some of you are not in that place, but there are a lot of us who are. And so how do we move past this? How do we find grace in the midst of this? And so to literally be political and say, we're living in a time of great fear. We're living in a time of great anxiety. And that divisiveness is spiked even more to this election, the divisiveness that's there. And so I know a lot of preachers who will say, the comment I get more than anything else is that I'm being too political. And I'm like, if Jesus preached that sermon, they would look at him and go, come on, dude, seriously? I mean, really? But this is a guy who, walked in on a unridden colt into Jerusalem and said, hey, you guys want me? I'm right here. Come and get me. I ain't hiding, right? I mean, that's the Jesus that we're called to follow. And he was constantly raising the roof and letting people open the roof to lower people down. And he was constantly, talking to the people who had been marginalized in that society, and we continue to learn that lesson. And so creating brave space to talk about the issues is different from saying that political party or this political party is wrong. It's to say, can't we find a place where we care about the people that this argument is about? Can't we find a place where we can be brave enough to say to the Tusada family, I know you're scared, but we're here for you. To look at that queer kid who had just come out to be in youth group and say, it's going to be okay. There are people here for you. And that is the bravest thing I think we can do, is to just be Christ's arms and hands and hug them and be there for them. And so sometimes it's not all done in the pulpit. Some is done outside the pulpit that then we can say, here is the ways that we're making an impact on the folks who've been very scared for the last few weeks. I think that.
That's great.
I love how the book is, while being so attentive to what preachers need as they go about queering the pulpit. I also love how the book is so attentive to the communal aspects, the congregational aspects, all the dynamics that are going on, and you're sort of preparing preachers for the work outside of the pulpit that has to happen alongside. When we talk more about the logistics of how this happens in preaching, I want to bring back up a term that you already mentioned in this interview, actually. So we're going to get more into this idea of crafting sermons related to creating sermons. So not just writing sermons, but crafting them. And for me, this brought up not only the way that you talk about it taking into account the listener, crafting a sermon because it's for the the hearing and receiving, not just the reading of listeners of our congregants, but crafting for me also means taking into account this much broader range of processes behind the writing that are at work as we bring these sermons into existence. So processes that are creative, introspective, communal, conversational, ecological, and so many more. So I love that so much. And then there's another term that you use closely related, like closely woven in this part of the book that you mentioned, which is sexegetical framework for preaching. So this framework, and I'm going to quote you for just a moment, it's intended to name and claim space for a brave new way of sermon crafting rooted in inclusion and care. It's such a great term. So I actually had to add it to my Grammarly dictionary when I was kind of writing notes for the book and prepping. Yeah, because I was like, no, don't try to change this term. It is sexegetical. That's what we're talking about. So will you say more about what sexegetical sermon crafting involves and how it prioritizes the needs of queer folks in our congregations and beyond?
Yeah, let me first start with the word crafting. I have heard a lot of sermons in my life. You guys have, you're preachers preaching classes, and you hear, 4 or 5 sermons from every single student and every single elective and required course that you have. And we probably listened to 1,000 sermons over, the years. I have no idea. I haven't kept track. And one of the things that has frustrated me is that a lot of students come in and they begin to understand sermon writing as them doing like an exegetical paper or a theological paper for one of their professors, right? And so that involves a very particular type of writing, and it's writing to be read. It is writing with intention. It's writing with no sort of space breaks. It's not with pause. It's not with inflection. It's not with an understanding that I need to dig deeper into this particular image. It is writing an academic paper. And to break students of that, attempt to break students of that, I started talking about sermon crafting. And if someone says, I'm writing my sermon, I say, no, you're not. You're crafting a sermon. Because what I want them to do is embrace all the different parts of them. And so one of my favorite days that we have an introduction to preaching class is I bring in 30 small tubs of Play-Doh and, 25, 24 or 48 crayons and all different kinds of papers and origami stuff. And we just they start talking about a text that means something to them. And then it's like, okay, let's create it. And so they literally will use the Play-Doh and they'll create, Zacchaeus tree, or they'll, create a river, or they'll create creation. And they're doing this stuff, and they're having to engage a different part of their brain.
Yeah.
A part of their brain that is not about academia. It's not about, I have to get the theology all right and the exegesis all right. It's about, in this moment, what image is coming to your mind? What manipulation are your hands requiring you to do to make what you're thinking in 3D form or in 2D form? And so we do a lot of that, sort of imagining and playing with the text. And so I invite them to read the text in several different, versions early in the week, and then to tell that story just themselves. Don't read it again, just tell the story. And so we practice storytelling, we practice images, we try to find little snippets that may have jumped out of the text at them. And so they get all that stuff sort of sideways from an academic paper, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, I want to write something that can be heard. And so it has to have pause. It has to have an intentional flow up and down. And it has to have, if it's a story, a beginning and an end. And that crafting can bring in all kind. I mean, I've had students who've gone in and they were crocheting something that they, created because it came from a sermon idea. And so getting those kind of things out there and trying to help folks say, how is the person going to hear this if you're reading it? And so part of it is the crafting, but the other part of it is the delivery, which, by the way, is the next book I'm working on called Delivery Matters. It's about all these
Right.
different delivery
Yes.
vehicles and how best to move through those. And so that's really important to me. The word sexegetical, as I said, I gave it as a paper. I can't remember if I was a student or not. I have to go back and see what year I presented it. But I just kept thinking that exegesis, the practice of examining a text for preaching, has these solid delineated ideas that it needs to do. It needs to go in cultural, historical, all these different things that we need to look at. And like I said, this is before I came out, so this was a really scary thing for me to do that paper at the Academy of Homiletics. But I felt no one else is going to read these papers. Probably many of the Academy don't read these papers, and so I think I'm safe. And I remembered after Cindy reminded me about that paper. I remember sitting there and thinking, I want people to think about sexuality and gender and all these things while they're doing the exegesis. And
Yes.
so it just popped in my head, literally. It just sexegetical process for preaching. And I just kept refining it over the years. And the semester before I finished the book, or the semester right after, I actually taught queering the pulpit as an elective, and went through all that stuff and helped them. They were doing the Sexegetical project and process, and it really is. It's looking at the cultural, it's looking at the historical, it's looking at the concretized location, the community of faith, and seeing where are they on this journey. So maybe it's not a sermon that starts. Maybe it's an adult forum where you talk about things and you're not in church. Maybe it's at another time, but it's trying to get them to understand if they use a process that forces them to look through a different lens. We talked about the Good Samaritan story. If we use a process that makes them or challenges them or asks them to look at how they're going through these texts from a different viewpoint and what it would look like if I'm thinking about the cultural and the historical and the biblical condemnation that has been heaped on the queer community, maybe that makes me, hopefully that makes me willing to do something different about it, even if it's small steps. Maybe it's just when we're doing the prayer, and instead of praying for our brothers and sisters, maybe we say, I'm praying for all our siblings. And maybe when you do that litany of, sexism and racism, and you add transphobia and homophobia, and maybe you just do these little steps. And you may have somebody say, I can't believe you said that in the prayer. And you say back, I'm glad you were listening. I'm glad you were listening, because what you want to say is, you're the one I said that for.
Right.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's just it's just been percolating for such a long time that to actually see it in print. When I got the first copy and I put my hand on it, I started crying. And part of that was my dad died in July, and he never got to read it. And we had talked about it a number of times, but just holding it was really a holy moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate also how you open this book up and remind us that this book isn't just for queer folks who are preaching to fellow queer folks, but it's for the grandparent who is trying to figure out ways to remain in relationship with their trans grandchild, or it's about people who are trying to, be in relationship with their neighbors who have different, sexual or gender orientations than they do. And I love that. And I love that, you could have you talk about not using clobber passages, but you could have clobbered the church for all the ways that it has failed, but instead you went high when others are going low, to quote another first
Yes.
lady of our life. And so I wanted you to talk about that priestly dimension that cuts through this whole thing. While you're always being prophetic in this book, but I was really touched by the ways that you were sensitive to, the pastoral care dimensions
Yeah.
of this. And I think this is going to have a big impact on people who read the book, both people who are queer identified and those who are not.
And that's my hope. It really is. I definitely wrote this more for straight pastors or queer pastors who are too scared, to sort of go out there, but also for them to understand the perspective of those people, sitting in the pews and trying to deal with, their own lives. And I've been hurt a lot by the church. I was 10 years old when the Methodist Church declared that I am incompatible with Christian teaching. And that has been a part of that tradition until, a year or so ago. I didn't know at 10, but looking back, it was like the vast majority of my life, it's been,
Yeah.
you're incompatible. And, I've had lots of folks, straight and gay, who have been so supportive of me and my journey. There were others who were like, why did you stay so long? And there are so many people who say, I just don't know that I can do what you did. I don't know that I can preach that sermon. I don't know that I could be there, for this queer couple. I'm too scared to do a wedding, before it was legal. And still in the ELCA, where I teach at an ELCA seminary, and they basically have congregational option, and so they can say, no, we don't want a gay pastor, or yes, we do. And they can say, no, we can't do weddings at this church for same-sex partners. Or they can say, there's only 11% of the denomination where I teach that has reconciling in Christ churches. And we have a lot of queer students coming through,
Wow.
and it's like, where are we going to send them? Because it's a lot more than 11% that, we're having to send folks to churches where it might not be safe. And we're like, no, we can't do that. We got to figure out ways. And so part of it, I think, is there's an educational piece that I think is very important. I started here 15 years ago, and we have a meeting with the bishops every fall. And I've asked the same question every fall since the first fall that I met with them. I said, what are you doing to prepare congregations to receive queer students, to receive queer interns, to receive queer called pastors? And they are still not good at answering that question. And so, we live in this world where it's so scary. And when you talk about pastors, their life insurance, their health insurance, their pension, all their housing, all of that is wrapped up in this job. And so standing up in the pulpit and proclaiming something that might tick people off, that's scary, right? And so, but I also think that as a preacher, we're privileged to be able to walk into the pulpit. And Gene Lowry, who was my preaching professor when I went to St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City, Missouri, said on many occasions, if you walk into the pulpit and you're not scared just a little bit, if you walk into the pulpit and there's not a little bit of anxiety, turn around and get out of it, because you're not walking into it with the intentionality of saying something prophetic or transformative, or, and I believe that. And so part of the priestly function that I think we have is to proclaim the good news. And if I proclaim the good news, it's the good news to the captive. It's the good news to the poor. It's the good news to the blind. It's good news for those who are of different race than I am. It is the good news to queer siblings. It is the good news to the immigrant coming across the border who's walked, 5,000 miles because she's afraid that her two kids will be killed because her family is on, the death list back in her country. And so the good news, if we're truly preaching the good news, it has to be a good news for everybody. If it's not the good news. It's not the gospel. And so for me, challenging students to live into that is something that I think basically I shouldn't have to do. If we're called to minister, if we're called to proclaim the good news, then preach the damn gospel. Timothy Wingert was a longtime theology professor here, and students had T-shirts made up with saying "Preach the damn gospel" because that's what he said every semester. I don't care what else happens, preach the damn gospel. And I have actually worn that T-shirt on occasion because some people get ticked off by the phrase, but it's okay with me. I'm okay if they're uncomfortable with that. But to say the
Yeah.
gospel is the gospel for everybody. It's not, I'm going to preach a different gospel to Jake than I am to the queer student in my classroom. I'm not going to preach a different gospel to Ashley than the immigrant family who's, swimming across a river, not knowing that the state has put wire cutters under the water that are going to cut up her child's legs as he comes through that water. It's got to be the same gospel. And so the priestly function is to preach the gospel, and to preach the gospel again, and to preach the gospel again, and to preach the gospel again, and again, and again, until everybody understands what that gospel is. And it's a gospel that is wrapped up in grace and has a bow on top of it of acceptance. And that's what I pray for everybody as they enter into a pulpit.
From that, I'm thinking about really the contrast of that way of preaching as opposed to the way these so-called, clobber passages that you talk about throughout the book have been used and are continually used to denigrate queer people and to really harm people in their most vulnerable moments. And so the way that you set up this radically inclusive homiletic, it applies even when we aren't preaching related to those specific clobber passages. We need to know about those. We need to know what they are. We need to know the stories of how they've been used. And then what you're really telling us is there's a way to go beyond this kind of topical sermon and to make this radically inclusive preaching happen throughout all of preaching and church community life.
Yeah.
I think about similarly, I do a lot with ecological preaching, and it's moving beyond this idea that there are green scriptures that are related to creation,
Right.
and then there's everything else. No, how can preaching really this radically inclusive idea undergird all of our preaching? And so I think you do a great job of showing us what that can look like in the book. Could you give us some examples from your preaching ministry about how this works for you, how this radically inclusive homiletic is at work throughout your preaching, and how can preachers begin to embrace this approach? What power does it have for positive change so that they don't feel like they are preaching a queer sermon every single week, but they have a radically inclusive homiletic at work through everything they do?
Yeah, one of the things one of the places where I learned this sort of understanding of the sort of duality of Scripture and how it can be powerful and profoundly painful is from my Black students. When I first started teaching, I was at Hood Theological Seminary, which is an AMEZ in just north of Charlotte, North Carolina. Has about half of their population is United Methodist. And when we started talking about the Bible and what was important to them, it often was the Exodus. It was the story of liberation. It was a story of God not abandoning them in this place that was killing them. And so then we would go and we would talk about some of the epistles that talked about slavery being okay, and it's like there were two different conflicting ideas about slavery, about liberation, about how we interpret text, and it was just so deeply important to them. And I learned that, and I listened to them preach from those texts, and sometimes they would put them together in a sermon, and they would talk about what it meant to understand liberation in a context where the church wasn't ready for it when it first began, that the church didn't have a concept, and that this is a totally different way of looking at the biblical text. And so, I'd been in situations where the clobber text, one or two, were used. When I was in West Texas growing up, I didn't know a single other person who was gay. Nobody. Later found
Wow.
out that there were like 6 people in my class who were gay, but none of us knew,
Yeah, right.
none of us were out.
Wow.
And so,
Yeah.
I'd go, it didn't happen at my church. That was my dad's, was my preacher and pastor and dad. But I would go to like revivals with some of our friends to the Baptist church or some evangelical conservative congregation. And they would start naming all the sins. And then all of a sudden, they'd start talking about those queers, those faggots. And I would just sit there going, holy crap, they're talking about me. What if they know? What if they know? What do I do? Do I leave? Do I just duck down? He's going to call me out. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. And so I stopped going to church with it. I was like, I'm not going to any other revivals and stuff like that. But you heard it in media, you heard it, in TV shows. Someone might say that faggot over there, and I would hear it. In West Texas, sort of the worst thing that you could be called was a queer or a faggot, and those terms were not just derogatory; they were a threat. They were an open threat. It was not
Yeah.
just I'm calling you something, but I'm calling out so that others know who you are, so that we can condemn your life, that we can beat the crap out of you, outside of gym or whatever. And I knew people who I know now were not gay, but they got beat up because they wore a pink shirt. I have actually a pink shirt today. I don't typically go with pink, but that's funny. He wore a pink shirt and they beat the crap out of him. Out on the track. And so you hear that stuff as a kid. I mean, I'm like 14, 15, 16 years old. And I think being me is dangerous. And you keep moving forward. I went to a couple of churches when I was in college, and I just couldn't find any that I felt were saying you're important or you're someone that matters. I didn't hear clobber passages, but I also didn't hear whoever you are, you're welcome
Right.
here. No matter what journey you're on, you are loved. I didn't hear, no matter how your life expresses itself or how you express your life, you belong here and you're okay. And so when I didn't hear the condemnation verbally, I heard it because that was not spoken. It's like churches who prayed and bowed down after Sandy Hook, but they would not do that for the Pulse nightclub victims in Orlando who were queer and brown and black for the most part. And so it's that thing where if I don't hear acceptance, you're letting the loudest voice overtake it, because the loudest voice of the church says, you're a fag, you're going to hell. And so trying to create a space in my own ministry early on to say, I can't say who I am, but I can say to every one of you sitting in this room, I love you just for who you are. And that's a start, right? I think I've drifted off,
Yeah.
Jake. I may have not answered your question. But I think part of it for me is that I don't want anybody else sitting there terrified because a passage is used against them.
Yeah.
Yep.
I also don't want anyone sitting there when things happen in the world that could be named is not named.
Right.
And when you say the list of sins, you don't say transphobia. You don't
Right.
say homophobia. You don't talk about misogyny. When you don't list those as the
Yeah.
sins of the world and the sins of the church, you're sending me a message that you're not even willing to say, we suck at some things. We're really not good in the way that we talk about things. So I guess for me, it's I don't want to yell down the clobber passages, but if you invite me to your church, I have a 6-week study that I do on the queer passages, all of this stuff that I've been doing, for the past. Cindy and I will just celebrate our 9th anniversary, and I've been doing these kind of trainings and lessons and forums and all kinds of stuff for 9 years because I was too scared to do it before, and now I'm like, invite me. I'll talk about this, until I'm blue in the face, because I got to a point. I'm 62 years old, and I have only been out and able to use my full voice for 9 years. And that sucks. And I don't want that for anybody else. And so it's trying to figure out that balance, Ashley, is, how do I speak truth into the world that has heard these texts in a particular way, and they don't even have a framework for how you question that,
Right.
right? But then how do I also, by not attacking them, but saying, here's some other ways that we can think about it. And also when I pray, I'm going to include you, my queer little friend. Yeah. So I think that's the balance that we have to try to figure out. I hope that answered your question. I think I went off in a tangent, but
Yes.
I came back, I think.
No, so
No, it
appreciate
was
it.
all good. And Karen, that I've been a big fan of your work for years, and was so excited when this book came out. But I'm interested to hear what kind of a reception you received when you've been talking about this with other church groups and with preachers. Hopefully, it's been a
It
big
has
buzz.
been really, really amazing. I have gotten all
Oh,
different
good.
responses from homileticians who are going to require it for their classes in the spring or
Yep.
next year.
Great.
I've
Yep.
gotten great responses from sort of my group of pastors. I've got, I don't know what Facebook numbers mean, but there's like 5,000 or whatever followers and friends and that kind of
Yes.
stuff. And so when I first started posting it,
Damn.
and
Great.
I had created a Facebook page for the book as well, and invited people to be a part of that so they could know the different stations. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback. I've also gotten a couple of "you're going to burn in hell" kind of comments that I quickly delete because I just don't want
Hmm.
other people to feel like they need to have the energy to defend me.
Yeah.
And I've had some inbox messages with some pretty graphic kind of not threats, but at the same time, it's we know where you teach, and so the seminary. I don't think anybody's going to do anything about those things. Most of the time, it's just people being stupid and spouting their hate.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, 99% of the response has just been very, very positive. And
Mm.
I feel like it's the book that I've been waiting to write my whole life. And
Oh,
I
so
wrote it for
beautiful.
that little 4-year-old who walked up the aisle in her chaps and her six guns and her boots,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
her spurs jangling in the floor, with her dad going, "Oh my God!"
That was such a great story in the book.
So yeah,
Such a
that
wonderful
little girl
image.
started that journey, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've never made money much on the stuff that I've written. I haven't written that much stuff.
Me
And
neither.
my first book was like in 2013, and I got they send you like every quarter they'll send you something, for what is. And I think the last quarter it was like 1947 or something like
Wow.
that. And I think the biggest check I ever got was like, I don't know, close to 1,000, but it was right after it came out. And so I
Damn.
didn't. It is
That's
impressive.
impressive, Karen.
I didn't write this to make money. I didn't write it,
Yeah.
to. I wrote it because I had to. It
Hmm.
was in here, and I had to
Yeah.
write it, and it's opened up a part of me in ways that I just keep looking at myself and going, "You wrote that, and that's your story, and people love it, and they're going to learn from this." And
Yeah.
the people who use it, I think are going to be really great. I had a woman come to my office last Friday. She called and asked if she could come by, and I said, "Okay, what time?" And she said, "Well, can you give me a little window of like 30 minutes?" And I said, "Yeah, I have class, and I'll be there during that time period." And she walked in and she had 5 of my books. And I
Wow.
said, "Oh, okay, what's going on?" She said, "I want you to autograph these. And we're going to write." So 3 of them were Christmas gifts to people who she knew would love it. And 2 of them were gifts for a pastor that she knew needed it. And so, this little covert, she's sending these 2 books to somebody, or 2 books to 2 people. And I just wrote, "I hope that you'll be open to the journey. And
Oh,
God
yes.
bless you," and, something like that. But I mean, that's cool. She's spreading that to people who she knows will get something from it, and people that she hopes will get something from it, and that's good.
Yeah.
It's good.
I
Yeah.
I think the aspect of the book that allows for the certain church conversations to happen so that the pastor and other leaders in the church are empowered to preach with this homiletic. It makes me think how even certain churches could be set up to do this as a book study, to look at this book
Oh,
together.
yeah.
And because it is, I just want to name that for our listeners, like it is so attentive to the congregational dynamics that are at work, and really making queering the pulpit be something that the whole church can participate in.
Yeah, that it's not
It,
just it's not
right.
that the preacher up up at the
Yes.
pulpit. It's the people sitting there, and I think I mean that's a fabulous image. It's just having
Yes.
everybody sort of welcome this in and figure out how to do this well in their own context. That's awesome.
Well, we will be praying for that kind of
Thank you.
response, that it is just abundant and overwhelming, and we'll be cheering this book on, telling everybody we know about it too.
Thank you.
It certainly is so helpful to read, and personal in the sharing of your stories. You're so courageous to do this work, no matter how many years you get to be in this position of being out and being really loud about the messages that you have to share. We need this in the world and in the church, and I have so much gratitude for you for writing it. So thank you, and thank you for this conversation.
Oh, it's been amazing. I thank you guys for inviting me in. It's something I have that I can talk about for hours if somebody wanted me
Yes,
to. So
and we would.
there you go. Yeah, we would. We'd just sit there doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Wiseman, for your wisdom and for sharing this gift to the church and especially to preachers. I know this is going to make a big impact on the future of homiletics. And I know that this is your book that you've been kind of
Yeah.
waiting to write since you first were called into ministry. And I'm glad that it's out there in the
And
world.
I have to give a special shout out to Jake. When we started talking about this book a couple of years ago, and I started writing it, I thought, I don't even know who to send it to. And Jake, I don't remember how the email started, but I said something to Jake about the book, and Jake said, well, you ought to talk to my editor who did, his last book. And so I thought, okay, I'll just put it out there. And I sent them, I went through the site, got all the stuff they wanted. I sent it on a Friday, and the automatic message I got back was, the process is it can take 4 to 6 weeks, for us to get through these things. That next Thursday, I got an email from the editor saying that they were
Awesome.
interested, and I had a book contract within a couple of weeks. And so Jake
That tells you
Jake
how
hooked
much
me
we
up.
need this book.
Yes, it also it's thanks to Jake for hooking me up. That's a good thing too. Thanks.
Oh, well, the small part that I played, I'm happy to have done that. And it was easy because I was just
Yeah.
telling the truth.
Thanks.
And yeah, it's a great
Thank you
book.
both.